So, hi, Irene.
Hey, Eric.
What I'd like to do today, um, each of the steps offers some sort of gestalt unifying principles. And today, what I'd like to talk about with you is the Drop the Rock book, the first book that is Drop the Rock Removing Character Defects, about steps 6 and 7. It's by an author, Bill P., and also Todd W. and Sara S. also contribute. Of course, we don't use their real last names in AA, being as that's confidential information. And so what I want to do is load up here on, this is the wrong book. Load up here on my Kindle, the right book. Here we are, Drop the Rock. So Drop the Rock, and I know that you had a chance to look at the introduction, I think, right?
I did, yes.
So let's see, I got to backtrack here. It went to where I was recently. Probably it's easier to find the introduction this way. Here we are. So the introduction of the book lays out some of the basic information about how this book is constructed, as well as it starts out with a story that apparently was made popular by an AA speaker quite some time ago. And I actually haven't listened to the recording of this story the way it was originally told. And so I'm not familiar with that part of it. In fact, I actually don't really even like the story that this begins with. But on the other hand, I realize it does open some awareness about that we have some common defects of character that in fact have to be addressed. And I wonder if you saw some of that in the introduction as you're reading through it.
I sure did.
Yeah.
I found the stories quite nice. They were simple.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I did see. It's a good introduction.
Good. So let's jump in, and if you don't mind, I'll ask if you would read it. Can you see the screen okay?
I sure can.
Can you read from it also?
I can. Thanks.
Good. Excellent. So well, I'll let you read, and I'll interrupt every once in a while. I think we'll just read right through the first story, though, and then I'll interrupt every once in a while.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Seems there was this group of 12-step members taking a boat ride to this island called Serenity. It was truly a happy bunch of people. As the boat pulled away from the dock, a few on board noticed Mary running down the street, trying to catch up with the boat. One member said, "Darn, she missed the boat." Another said, "Maybe not. Come on, Mary. Jump in the water. Swim. Swim. You can make it. You can catch up with us." So Mary jumped into the water and started to swim for all she was worth. She swam for quite a while and then started to sink. The members on board, now all aware that Mary was struggling, shouted, "Come on, Mary. Don't give up. Drop the rock." With that encouragement, Mary started swimming again, only to start sinking again shortly afterwards. She was going under when she heard all of those voices shouting to her, "Mary, drop the rock. Let it go. Drop the rock." Mary was vaguely aware of something around her neck, but she couldn't quite figure out what it was. Once more, she gathered her strength and started swimming. She was doing quite well, even gaining a little on the boat. But then she felt this heaviness pulling her under again. She saw all those people on the boat holding out their hands, hollering for her to keep swimming, and shouting, "Don't be an idiot, Mary. Drop the rock." Then she understood when she was going down for the third time. This thing around her neck. This was why she kept sinking when she really wanted to catch that boat. This thing was the rock they were all shouting about. Resentments, fear, dishonesty, self-pity, intolerance, and anger were just some of the things her rock was made of. "God, help me get rid of the rock," she prayed. "Now, get rid of it." Mary managed to stay afloat long enough to untangle a few of the strings holding that rock around her neck. realizing as she did that, her load was easing up. Then, with another burst of energy, she let go. She tore the other strings off and dropped the rock. Once free of the rock, she was amazed at how easy it was to swim, and she soon caught up with the boat. Those on board were cheering for her and applauding and telling her how great she was and how it was so good having her with them again. And now they could get on with their boat ride and have a nice time. Mary felt great and was just about to indulge in a little rest and relaxation when she glanced back to shore. There, a ways back, she thought she saw something bobbing in the water. So she pointed it out to some others. Sure enough, someone was trying to catch the boat, swimming for dear life, but not making much headway. In fact, it looked like the person was going under. Mary looked around and saw the concern on the faces of the other members. She was the first to lean over and shout, "Hey, friend, drop the rock." Mike?
So this story illustrates for us um, a an almost obstinance about it, that there's something that Mary is carrying that she doesn't seem very aware of at all, except when it totally interferes with what it is that she's trying to accomplish. And I wonder if you see that in this story also.
I definitely do. And it's great that Mary has that kind of support.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So we just had a meeting recently on Zoom, and there was about 40 people or so that showed up. And I was happy that it seemed that it was a very, very grateful group that we could have a meeting together.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like some of those issues about, like, I didn't know this was coming and all that sort of stuff, the unmanageability about our lives seemed to be really relevant at that
Mm-hmm.
particular meeting, with people realizing, now my whole life has changed. Like, I really depended on being able to go to these meetings and have that support. And all
Mm-hmm.
of a sudden, like, wow, all those meetings are closed.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them are not functioning, and they're not open. And so it was nice to be able to provide a Zoom meeting for people and see that, I had a good idea there. It really was something that was useful. We really do need to look at what it is we're not aware of that suddenly sometimes comes into our lives that makes our lives unmanageable. Let's take a look at what Mike says.
Okay. Mike shares his experiences with dropping the rock. Before its discussion of step 4, the big book says our liquor was but a symptom, so we had to get down to cause and conditions. A thorough inventory reveals those causes and conditions. The 5th step allows us to share them with God and another human being, and so remove the inner pain they have caused in our past lives. After finishing my 5th step, I discarded the inventory, but kept a single page that listed my major character defects. That list would come in handy later. The first time I read step 6, I thought it meant I had to arrive at some angelic state of mind in which I would become and forever remain entirely ready to have God remove all my defects. Scroll, please. I had forgotten AA's promises spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. 12 and 12 set me right. It calls step 6 AA's way of stating the best possible attitude one can take in order to make a beginning on this lifetime job. To me, that means step 6 is not a one-time matter. It stretches over a lifetime of recovery. Even that best possible attitude is always just a beginning. One morning, while I was at Hazelden's Fellowship Club in St. Paul, Minnesota, I awoke very early and knew it was time to make that beginning. I took out the list of defects, read it over, asked myself 2 questions. Why are you holding on to these things? And what did these things ever do for you? I may choose to hold on to them for fear of letting go, but holding on to them for years and years led me into alcoholism. So I got on my knees. I recited the big book's Step 7 prayer, which asks God's help in replacing our willfulness with His will for us. The 12 and 12 calls that replacement a basic ingredient of all humility. I went to Hazleton for treatment because I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. I believe we get active with Step 6 when we get sick and tired of being sick and tired of the character defects of which alcoholism is a symptom, sick and tired of their effect, not on our past, but on our present lives. In this ongoing process, the program is asking us to go where none of us had ever been before, into lives of lessened fear, diminished anger, pure resentments, and genuine self-esteem instead of self-pity. There is a price, however, the willingness to challenge and change patterns of thought, speech, and behavior that may have gone unchallenged for 10, 20, 30 years or more.
Right. So it could be that a long time that some of these issues really sort of fester, and festering, or the sort of precursor to bitterness and resentment and so on and so forth, oftentimes just goes unnoticed, sort of behind, underneath the surface. Below the surface of awareness, there lurks many thousands of fears, perhaps, and guilt is one of the greatest of these. Guilt, in my opinion, we might as well say guilt demands punishment. When in fact I feel guilty about my past, when in fact I feel guilty about my present, when I in fact feel guilty about what happens, about what's going to happen in the future because of the past, I in fact project that outward as if the world is responsible for my suffering, as if the world is responsible for my condition, as if there is an invisible rock now around my neck, which represents the world, which is dragging me under and drowning me in my own complacency or my own absence of awareness about the truth of it is I'm constantly interrupted by the pains of the suffering of my past. And here, in fact, we're going to talk about the challenges to these patterns of thought, speech, behavior, and such that go unchallenged for a long time, perhaps in our lives. Certainly they did in mine. And the best possible attitude is always just in the beginning to wake up to that gently. And so step 6, as written here, is a ongoing sort of process. This author believes that, in fact, steps 6 and 7 and also step 10 are fundamental to the daily practice of an AA becoming more in tune with that it's about spiritual progress and not perfection. So this is an interesting story that's going to evolve here now into some of the fundamentals of what can I do and what is being provided for me, perhaps. I'm a believer in the great spiritual change that occurs in AA when, in fact, I believe that I don't have to know about what was wrong, per se, in such a way as to be able to explain to someone what all happened, but instead to be focused on what is happening now in the present as I'm being able to let go of and being willing to let go of my past failings in such a way as to take responsibility for it and see that it's been a burden that's hanging around my neck for all of these years. How about your impression, Irene?
I really like how it says a basic ingredient of all humility. For myself, I find humility is a tough one. And especially because I may be feeling some of these things like anger and self-pity. It's easier to lose the humility that we can find in self-appreciation and self-love and extending that out to others. I started in Al-Anon when I was a teenager. I was 13, I think. and graduated into AA, unfortunately, in my 20s.
Hmm.
Now, this book is new to me, and I'm enjoying this. This is wonderful.
Oh, great.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad I was able to introduce it to you.
Yes,
So,
definitely.
I didn't start in Al-Anon, but I went to Al-Anon after I had become a member of AA.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I see, in fact, that Al-Anon has a little bit different focus, although their steps are exactly the same as AA.
Mm-hmm.
Their literature, though, is somewhat different, and the
It
focus of
is.
their use of those steps is somewhat different, also. And
Mm-hmm.
it was really a good experience for me. And my son, I introduced into Alateen, and he also found it very beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's go on. The author's going to talk a little bit about combining these stories now.
Okay. These stories from Mary and Mike are good illustrations for a better understanding of working the 6th and 7th steps. The 5 steps have supplied the foundation for recovery. The next 2 steps begin the active day-to-day solution, removing what blocks us from our usefulness to other people and to our higher power, and especially and ultimately what blocks us from ourselves. There are 4 basic reasons we won't be entirely ready to work with the 6th and 7th step. The first is conscious decision that we will never give up a specific character defect. Next, we blame our defects on others, people, situations, institutions. Third, we rationalize. Our capacity to rationalize is unlimited. Before recovery, we spent years on this one, throwing up barriers against unpleasant realities. Finally, it's denial. We are totally unaware of our own contribution to our problems.
Right, and so therein lies the attraction to obsessiveness, and the attraction also to burying more so any awareness of the truth about my own responsibility for what has happened in my life. And we see here, next, we blame our defects on others, people, situations, or institutions. That projecting that I was talking about, it just takes over, in fact, and it just, we begin to ruminate and fester about it, and we drink more. And as we drink more, we become more oblivious to the fact of that has to do with my own conscious choice now to poison myself with alcohol while I suffer from the ruminating and the festering. And I no longer can even really connect it to the truth, because now I've just projected it onto all the situations of my past and my fear of the future. And third, we rationalize in between drunkenness. We rationalize that our capacity, about our capacity, as it's been thought to be some sort of unlimited capacity that we would have. Before recovery, though, that we're throwing up barriers against the unpleasant realities is what it has actually become. So we no longer have a consciousness which is unlimited. We now have a consciousness which is constantly interrupted, constantly battering us with glimpses of the past and fear of the future. The projection of our defects of character has become now the fear of our future. You want to share anything before we go on?
No.
Let's go on then.
The order of the 12 steps occurs for a reason. There's not much use in doing our amends in step 8 and 9 if there is no sign of our willingness to change by doing steps 6 and 7. How many times in an active addiction did we say we were sorry without the slightest intent of changing our behavior so we wouldn't have to say we were sorry again? Working steps 8 and 9 is hollow unless we've begun working the 6th step with humility as our guide. The promises in the Big Book, page 83 and 84, come after the discussion of steps 8 and 9.
Let's hold on for a second, because I have a note here and I want to open that. It's going to look at the words of Sam Schumacher here, and He provides some insights in another book. That book is called Courage to Change. It's the Christian Roots of 12-Step Movement, is where, in fact, it was documented by Bill Pittman and Dick B. about what was learned from Sam Shoemaker. So Bill W. credited the Reverend Sam Shoemaker with passing on to him and to the early AAs the spiritual keys that made up the program in the 12 steps. Shoemaker wrote about the necessity of making daily surrenders. Yes, the sixth step is also about surrendering, just like the third. But Shoemaker made one point very clear. We surrender as much of ourselves to as much of God as we understand. In other words, our spiritual progress is based on, in and on direct proportion to our dropping the rock. We are very fortunate that all of our defects aren't revealed to us at once.
Hmm.
You may know that. I'm not sure how
I
many
do.
people actually can appreciate that fact of that. I certainly appreciate it by now.
Yeah.
We surrender as much of ourselves, therefore, to as much of God as we understand. In other words, our spiritual progress is based on direct proportion of our dropping the rock. We are very fortunate that all our defects aren't revealed to us at once, and recovery works by giving us daily insight into what we can do to remove those blocks. We need a daily awareness without interruption of projecting our fears and worries and past and ruminating and festering. We need a daily awareness of our character defects, that they're the opposite of the principles of our program. So Sam Shoemaker was an Episcopal priest, and he was the rector at the Calvary Episcopal Church in New York City, which is headquarters where the Oxford group met in the 1930s, and perhaps before that too. And he was a strong influence in the early AA organization. We'll get into that perhaps more as we go forward. So let's pick up here with his words. Whoops. Oh, I clicked it twice, sorry.
Let's look at the words of Sam Shoemaker. To gain some clarity on what the 6 and 7 steps are asking of us. Sam was a clergyman who ran Calvary Church and Mission, where first EPT and then Bill W., AA's co-founder and primary author of the Big Book, began their recovery. Bill W. credited Shoemaker with passing on to him the early AAs, the spiritual keys that make up the program and the 12 steps.
So that reminds me actually that most people, not everyone knows who Ebby was. Ebby was Bill's childhood friend. They actually grew up and they actually vacationed together just about every summer. And Ebby was worse drunk than Bill was. And Ebby one time showed up in a moment in between Bill's drunkenness where he was getting some help. And Ebby demonstrated to Bill that, in fact, there was a power greater than ourselves. And Ebby demonstrated to Bill that we don't have to believe in a specific definition about who God is and what he does in our lives, but we have to have a God of our understanding, perhaps. And this opened Bill's mind to the possibility that, in fact, there was a way to recover if only we could have a God of our understanding. And, in fact, we could make progress because of that progression of understanding that perhaps we would be able to open ourselves to, that there are spiritual keys. And this is the beginning of where Bill takes the Oxford group directives and he begins to turn it into the 12 steps.
I did not know any of that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Shoemaker wrote about the necessity of making daily surrenders. Yes, the 6th step is also about surrendering, just like the 3rd. But Shoemaker made one point very clear. We surrender as much of ourselves to as much of a God as we understand. In other words, our spiritual progress is based in the direct proportion to our dropping the rock. We are very fortunate that all of our defects aren't revealed to us all at once. Recovery works by giving us daily insight to what we can do to remove what blocks us. We need a daily awareness that our character defects are the opposite of the principles of our program. Shoemaker also passed on to the early AAs the idea that God reveals as much truth as you can live up to. The statement puts us directly on page 164 of the Big Book, where it says, "The answers will come if your own house is in order." The sixth step helps us to do that. Some have called the sixth and seventh step the forgotten steps because they aren't talked about that much. Others have called these steps the most important. Perhaps the whole program is about 6 and 7. By working the 6 and 7 steps, we are less likely in recovery to stay stuck in old, unproductive, negative behavior patterns. We gain more understanding on how all the steps, although ordered for a reason, need to be worked together. This prevents us from falling into the trap of understanding only just enough of the program to make us miserable and not enough to make us happy. For example, some of us might fall into the trap of thinking the support system of the fellowship meetings is the entire program of action. The action of the 6 and 7 steps accumulates in dropping the rock. All the stubborn, grasping, stupid, holding on to old patterns of behavior, thinking and feeling that are harmful to our progress in recovery. For another insight, let's return to Shoemaker, who believed progress in the spiritual life is based on our looking inward and upward, not outward and downward. Reading Drop the Rock is a way of getting into the principles behind the 6th and 7th step, not only for an understanding, but for action. We'll be looking at a number of ideas and examples of how men and women have made positive changes in their lives by working these steps and by showing up at meetings to tell others of their experiences. After doing our fifth step, many of us were directed to go home and to read the 2 paragraphs in the Big Book on the 6th and 7th steps, and then do the steps. Who wouldn't want to be rid of these character defects of character, especially after talking about them in the inventory process? We uncovered a list of pain and agony, and then shared it with another person and God. Of course, we wanted to be rid of these character flaws and habits. So we prayed to let our defects go and humbly asked God for help. We thought we had done the 6 and 7 steps, and that was that.
That was that, we thought. And I just want to share one thing about that, my insight on this over the years now. It's taken me many years for that to develop. Not just that one day, not just that 1 week, not just that 1 month, not just that first year. It's taken many years for this to develop. So this is, for me, this is definitely an ongoing process of realizing this weighty, unrealized, self-sabotaging set of interruptions that continue to occur and block me from my full awareness of the God of my understanding. Go ahead if you want to.
Then down the road, we started having the same difficulties and issues arising from the same defects that had plagued us before. We may not have practiced them or noticed them quite so much after doing a 5th step, but they returned with a force that scared and surprised us. We went back to our sponsor, said that perhaps we needed to do another 4th and 5th step. We were feeling and acting very similar to ways we used to feel and act. What should we do? Or perhaps after years in the program, things seem to have just gone flat. There doesn't seem to be the same old spark, and the meetings just aren't as interesting as they once were. We've drifted into a numb place where there seems to be little growth and little reason to change. Can we explain why we aren't entirely ready? Why can't we humbly ask, what's in our way? If our sponsor is a good one, perhaps he or she responds that maybe it isn't the 4th or 5th step that needs repeating, but is it time to take a real look at the 6th and 7th? Rather than blaming the program and the people in it for the flatness in our life, maybe it's time to rejuvenate the growth process through a jump start of the 6th and 7th steps, remembering that the program helps those who help themselves. The program works for those who understand it.
Let's continue, Amy. Unless you want to do you want to add anything?
No.
Let's go.
Bill's thoughts on principles versus character defects. I once spoke at an AA group's anniversary meeting in St. Paul, Minnesota, and left the members with a riddle. If the principles of 12-step recovery are not the 12 steps, then what are the principles? I returned to the same meeting about a year later to present a sponsee with a sobriety medallion, and a few people approached me with the following comment. I've been looking all year since your talk in the literature for the principles and can't find them. My answer to these group members was the same one I gave my sponsee. The principles of 12-step recovery are the opposite of our character defects. In recovery, we try to take the opposite of our character defects and shortcomings and turn them into principles. For example, we work to change fear into faith, hate into love, egoism into humility, anxiety and worry into serenity, complacency into action, denial into acceptance, jealousy into trust, fantasy into reality, selfishness into service, resentment into forgiveness, judgmentalism into tolerance, despair into hope, self-hate into self-respect, and loneliness into fellowship. Through this work, we learn to understand the principles of our program.
And I have included a PDF in our Facebook group, so people don't have to actually write that down while they're watching this video. They can actually get the PDF at the Drop the Rock Facebook group. And this is already there in that course, in that PDF. And I'm going through them like a section at a time. So there's an introduction PDF that includes all this material.
Awesome. That's great.
Thank you.
Such work may look like an overwhelming goal to an outsider, but those of us in recovery know that our true goal is progress, not perfection. As the Big Book tells us, we are not destined for sainthood, and we should not be discouraged when we cannot maintain anything like perfect adherence to the principles. The point is that we are willing to grow along spiritual lines. The principles are guidelines to progress. Also, the 12 and 12 states. AA's 12 steps are a group of principles, spiritual in their nature, which, if practiced as a way of life, can expel the obsession to drink and enable the sufferer to become happy and usefully whole. What exactly are these principles, and where did they come from? Over the years, a list of principles that correspond to each of the 12 steps has been printed in AA newsletters and on pocket cards. The origin of this list is unknown, although it is used by many 12-step members.
We can skip the list because also I did include that, of course, in the PDF as well. Each of them corresponds to the step, and they begin with honesty, hope, and faith. However, let me just clarify that normally people look at that in terms of honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness, and that's a little bit different approach when we look at the steps. Mm-hmm. The principles behind that actually are honesty, hope, and faith. Mm-hmm. But we need, when we look at the step, to develop honesty and to develop open-mindedness and to develop willingness. And willingness has two sides to it, in fact, and it takes great faith to see both sides of it and to accomplish the openness to accept then the peace of mind or the serenity that comes with the acceptance of true honesty, true hope, and true faith, where now I've been elevated above the level, again, of that interruption of awareness, above my ego, self-will, to become aware in some regard, in some respect, to become aware of the God of my understanding, that there is a God's will that in fact is my will, that I've been preventing myself from seeing that all along. So that's where these principles were derived, goes all the way back to that Oxford group and goes all the way back to the first 100 or so AAs and the many discussions that they had. Some of that actually not documented in the books. Let's finish up the chapter.
In this book, we and all those who've assisted us will attempt to take a real look at the 6 and 7 steps. We must learn to take the intellectual knowledge and turn it into emotional and spiritual reality, into living, so we can continue to change and grow and be useful. To become the person we can become, we must drop the rock. All the grasping and holding on to old patterns of behaving, thinking, and feeling that are harmful to ourselves and to others. The focus must become moving towards completion rather than away from unpleasant and uncomfortable habits and actions. Please join in this adventure of learning to put the 6 and 7 steps into action. Through these actions, we will be able to transform our lives and relationships.
Thank you, Irene. Greatly appreciate you reading that with me. Do you have any insights that you want to add before I go on to the next part?
No, I'm excited about
It's pretty
going
good, isn't
through
it?
this. It
Yeah.
is.
I want to demonstrate here where people can get in touch with this material, that I've put onto my Facebook group that I started recently, and it's called Drop the Rock for short, but it actually is. Well, let's try 100%. But it actually is 2 books. So it's Drop the Rock, the 2nd edition, as well as Drop the Rock, the Ripple Effect. The 2nd edition being Drop the Rock, Removing Character Defects, as it was originally written with some additional material that the author came up with after the release of that book and after getting some feedback and so on over the course of a couple of years. And so this group is on Facebook, facebook.com, and look for the group called Drop the Rock Steps, or just Drop the Rock. You'll find it pretty quickly also if you look and search in Drop the Rock. You just search that at Facebook. In fact, there isn't much out there really. So this one happens to be on top in my search. And there isn't much out there, which surprised me. When I went to set up the group, I kind of expected that there already were quite a few out here. And I really was just going to kind of sort of piggyback into one of them and add some of this material into one of the other groups. But there wasn't one out there that I could use.
Not very many at all.
No, and I did a pretty extensive search of them. And I even contacted a couple of administrators. There was one group that I considered, and then I realized, oh, well, no wonder she's not getting back to me. It's a women's group, a women's book study, Drop the Rock group. That was the one group that I had thought, like, maybe that will work out. And then I went back and looked at it again. I said, oh, how did I miss that? It was some women's book study. So, ladies, there's a Drop the Rock book group out there for you guys if you go and join this one. And if you want to, in the future, realize that this one here is just in the very, very beginning phases. And I have just set up the group, and I've begun to build some of these units, and I've just begun to go through the book with my friend Irene here. And I invite you to come and take a look at what's involved with Drop the Rock if you're not familiar with it, or if you are familiar with Drop the Rock, to come in here and help me to see, with me, to see what it is I can do to improve this for people that are more advanced and have already studied Drop the Rock, perhaps. So thanks, Irene, for doing this with me. We'll
My pleasure.
The video, and we'll start again with the next section, which is going to be getting into some of the deeper, really challenging stuff.
I look forward to it.
Thanks.